The crowd already built up a sense of anticipation for Patricia's grand performance. The young woman in question stood proudly in front of the contestants, certain that her Rosaria could wipe the floor with any other mech tested so far. She attracted attention more than just her prodigal performance. As the unattainable princess of the campus, she attracted admirers wherever she went, able to mesmerize her fellow students with her striking red locks and her enviable figure. Like a crane among chickens, her appearance made everyone else look plain. The Rosario she crafted out of the pile of junk also looked too good to be true. Despite its undersized legs and arms, Patricia somehow managed to keep the mech's weight under control. The medium mech's main feature was its modified shield. Patricia took a regular kite shield, made it a little thicker and added a lot of spikes and sharp edges to it. She turned the shield into a melee weapon no weaker than a sword. Its other arm held a flamethrower, which fed off the fuel cells installed on the mech's back. They were cellular, which meant that each fuel cell was detached once it ran out of fuel. It was a good way to keep the mech's weight under control, though it suffered from it at the start. The Rosario offered no other offensive options besides a backup knife and pistol strapped to its back. The mech weighed lighter than most other medium mechs on display so far, especially once its fuel cells ran out. In contrast, everyone else including Vase just wanted to cram as much in their mechs, so if they chose to go with a medium weight, it always weighed close to the maximum allowance. I bet the Rosario is going to make it to the end. Carlos laughed at that. I'd be a fool if I take you on that bet. Why not? The Rosario's only armed with a flamethrower and a spiked shield. Patricia isn't stupid. I think her mech is going to surprise all of us. When Hans directed the Rosario out of the gates, he immediately came under fire. A small ambush had been set at the start of the gauntlet. A lot of mechs would suffer severe damage with all the incoming laser and cannon fire. Hans utilized the Rosario's remarkable mobility to dodge the initial volleys and moved his shield in front to block what he couldn't avoid. As Hans successfully reached cover, he managed to preserve his undersized and under-armored legs. That was close, Carlos said as he was already sucked into the race. Do you think Hans is going to turn the tables on them? Vase shook his head even before Hans sneaked away. The mech possessed enough mobility to do so without attracting too much attention. Also, so long as the Rosario kept its flamethrower in reserve, the mech kept its heat profile under control, making it difficult to detect out of line of sight. Hans actually progressed 3 entire kilometers into the gauntlet without getting caught. It showcased Patricia's unwavering faith in her mech and the pilot in designing a lighter-than-usual medium-weight mech. The Rosario also possessed unusually long-range sensors, whose functioning had been tweaked to detect enemies further at the cost of longevity. Nevertheless, it lasted long enough for the gauntlet. Only an unusually high concentration of enemy mechs stopped the Rosario from sneaking its way throughout the entire gauntlet. With no other choice, Hans dove into the group of enemies and activated the flamethrower. A liquid white-hot stream escaped the nozzle of the fiery weapon, spraying the unprepared mechs with a shower of heat. The gaggle of mechs all spread out in terror as their armor melted while their softer components burned. Hans left the lighter mechs behind but gave the medium mechs an extra smack. As for the heavy mechs, unless they were armed with missiles and artillery, he left them behind to waddle in his wake. The Rosario's mobility is overwhelming. I'm surprised it holds up under heavy use. How did she do it in only 12 hours? Carlos wondered. She's got a strong grasp of the basics. Vase answered based on his own experience. As long as you know your stuff, you don't have to spend a lot time wrangling 2 different components together even if they are slightly incompatible. Don't look at the flashy flamethrower and shield, it's the seamless arms and legs that really make it stand out. Compared to the clunky patch jobs many of the previous mechs showcased, the Rosario looked as if the mech had been worked on for weeks instead of half a day. Hans brilliantly pushed his mech to the limits. As his fuel kept expending, he dropped more and more fuel cells, lightening the load which in turn raised the Rosario's speed. Any mech in its way got burned, and those that held out a little longer got bashed by the Rosario's deadly shield. It's starting to accumulate damage, Vase noted. He already expected something like this to happen. The gauntlet had a grueling reputation for a reason. The light mechs was the Rosario's Achilles heel. These mechs took advantage of the Rosario's lack of long-ranged weaponry and kept out of its range. Their superior speed allowed them to dog the Rosario and keep pelting it with lasers, rockets and ballistics. Though their threat was minimal, the numbers added up to a significant amount over time. Hans couldn't avoid taking more damage. The gauntlet ended before the light mechs finished the job. Give it up to Patricia Schneider. Her Rosario is the first mech to successfully pass the gauntlet. The entire crowd including Carlos and Faze gave Patricia a hearty applause. It truly impressed them all for accomplishing this much in only 12 hours of time. The woman basked in the cheers with a modest smile, as if the victory took little effort. A couple of other contestants followed next. None stood out too much except those made by the elites among the developers. Like Patricia, the designs of their work were sober, featuring not too much toys but using the few they had to their fullest potential. Their designs also focused on maintaining integrity, allowing Hans to push their mechs harder without letting it fall apart around him. Most of the other competitors couldn't even accomplish that much, leading to some embarrassing moments when a leg or an arm fell off. One mech even lost its head after it got hit by a single shell. After about half the contestants' work had gone up the stage, the presenter announced the end of the testing. Due to a shortage in time, we will pause the testing and resume it later tomorrow morning. Don't worry, Hans will continue familiarizing with the rest of the mechs tomorrow in order to allow him to run the gauntlet without interruption. The day had stretched on rather late. Many of the contestants hadn't eaten a proper dinner even. Vase dreaded the interruption as his mech hadn't gone up yet. Carlos came up to him and slapped his back, relishing the chance of comforting Vase instead of the other way around. Haha, don't stay up all night. It's going to be okay. I looked at your mech and it's a badass design. Nothing will go wrong tomorrow. Vase exited the venue with all the other contestants. Half of them already shook their heads with resigned expressions, while the other half dealt with the anxiety in a variety of ways. Unlike most of them, Vase possessed a decent amount of confidence in his design, so he didn't stew too long over the wait. He went back to the hotel and embraced a grouchy Lucky when he entered his room. Hey there, buddy. I hoped you haven't missed me long. The cat bit his hand a little to let his dissatisfaction known. It quickly perked back up when Vase fed it a mineral he picked up along the way back. Lucky's company distracted Vase from his worries, letting him fall asleep even as Durham's nightlife grew vibrant at the end of the first half of the Young Tigers exhibition. Many new young talents had shown off their chops, and the most shining stars among them would compete in the second half of the competition tomorrow. The next day came with an alarm. Like the previous day, Vase had to wake up early, though he didn't really need to be present during most of the gauntlet runs. Win or lose, Captain Jillian would inform him anyway. Still, Vase left his bed and prepared to leave early as he didn't want to miss anyone's gauntlet run. Just looking at how each contestant used the same circumstances to build wildly different mechs taught him a lot on how to build a design that was out of his comfort zone. The crowd that came to watch the testing had been reduced by a third. Many contestants who failed had dejectedly bowed out of the competition and left the stage for the real contenders. Vase thought it was a shame, but everyone was different. Like yesterday, the presenter came back up to the stage while Hans entered the simulation pod at the back. Thank you for your patience. I hope you had a good night's sleep, because we are starting the show again. First up, give the stage to Edwin McKinney's Sky Ripper. While Patricia's Rosario awed the crowd in showcasing the Bright Republic's best, it didn't beat the prestige of graduating from an institution of the new Rubarth Empire. The gigantic super-state possessed the best mechs, the best education and the most cutting-edge research. Edwin merely stood at the side looking completely unaffected by the glances thrown in his way. It was as if he was beneath such shallow pageantry. The Sky Ripper used a light and nimble avian design scheme, which different from humanoid mechs in many different ways. Its main divergence is its large, armored wings that integrated flight systems in a deeper level. Overlapping feathers shielded the vulnerable portions of the flight systems without excessively blocking thrust and allowing them to maintain flexibility. The mech could move the wings like arms, allowing the pilot to adjust its course in swift and delicate ways. It turned avian mechs into the fastest and most maneuverable mechs around. When Hans brought the Sky Ripper into the gauntlet, he transformed the light mech into a king of the sky. The mech flew rapidly in the air, avoiding plenty of ordnance thrown in its way by maneuvering through the fire with its graceful way of manipulating its massive wings. There comes the first obstacle. The gauntlet's reputation for nail-biting arduousness did not exempt flyers. If anyone thought a flying mech would get a free pass by flying really high in the air in order to reach 10 kilometers in a minute or two, they were wrong. The gauntlet adjusted to flying mechs with a little cheating by changing most of the light and medium mechs with flight-capable versions. The heavy mechs that remained received no change, as they were quite capable of throwing an incredible amount of ordnance at any flyer that was foolish enough to fly around in the open air. Hans encountered a couple of formation of flyers. He reacted to their appearance by diving low and using the structures as a way to cut their line of sight and interrupt their firing lines. Through a mix of hit-and-run tactics and luring the enemy out of position, the Sky Ripper masterfully decomposed a large group of flyers into a bunch of wrecks and disoriented machines. The Sky Ripper's dominance relied on its impressive flight system, its unparalleled flexibility, and its aerial speed dominance over the clunkier light mechs. When the Sky Ripper went all out, it utilized two devastating ways to tear its opponents apart. First, the beak of the avian mech opened up to reveal a compact cannon. It didn't fire a lot due to the limited ammunition the light mech carried, but every shot made it close-range felled a light mech. Its second option to kill were its incredibly sharp talons. Edwin modified them with sharpened armored spikes that allowed each swoop and diving attack to tear straight through the thin armor of flying mechs. The only mechs that presented a threat to Edwin's masterful implementation of a flyer were the heavy mechs on the ground. While the urban environment posed many problems in firing at the low-flying Hans, they still utilized their indirect fire weapons to great effect, especially missiles. Benefiting from the sensors locks the light mechs maintained on the Sky Ripper, the many missiles honed in on Hans as if a hive of bees got enraged by a bear that stole their honey. The Sky Ripper responded by spreading its wings and firing rapid-firing lasers at the missiles. Edwin somehow managed to strip most of the housing of laser weapons and mount them on the wings with minimal weight impact. He furthermore linked them to a set of high-quality targeting sensors embedded in the thin mech's chest. Hans was able to rely on the auto-targeting to shoot down most of the missiles while keeping his attention focused on evading or killing the flyers. Hans easily reached the end of the gauntlet after suffering only superficial damage. The Sky Ripper absolutely smashed the gauntlet. The presenter went up the stage again and highlighted the eye-popping statistics. Edwin has produced a virtual masterpiece, easily transforming a couple of parts into a coherent mech that dazzles the mind. Let's give it up for Edwin McKinney, everyone. Everyone present applauded Edwin, who still looked as if the event meant nothing to him. He easily beat Patricia's records and took absolute first place in the gauntlet runs. Everyone either admired him or wished they could take his place. Sadly, Edwin kept his socialization to his circle of sycophants, making it difficult for other admirers to even come close. Hans took a couple of mediocre mechs out on a spin, this time showing that reaching Edwin and Patricia's level was difficult. Vase thought back on the performance of the two mechs and had to admit they had a much better grasp on the fundamentals than him. It really showed in how well the two integrated the components seamlessly into a whole, while Vase forced his jury-rigging skills to forcefully fuse different components. Vase could claim superiority in only one aspect. He designed his mech with a focus on the X factor. Edwin's avian flyer was a technical marvel that astounded the crowd with its high capabilities. However, outside of its great build, Vase felt the mech was a lifeless brick. Edwin invested virtually no emotions in its construction, as if the mech was nothing but dirt underneath his feet. Even Patricia did better than him, as she put a tiny bit of care in her own creation. He shook his head. The X Factor might be fine and dandy, but the bottom line was that strength trumped over everything. Who cared if the X Factor allowed pilots to make the most out of their mech if it was built out of paper? On to our next contestant. This bad boy here is the Drake, designed by FaZe Larkinson. I love the mix. I'm looking forward to see what Hans can magic up with this beast. This was the moment FaZe had been waiting for. It was do or die. All FaZe could do now was to pray for Hans and hope his mech held together long enough to make it to the end. Hans stepped into the gauntlet with a running start. The Drake raised eyebrows when it first appeared. Its humanoid form moved around with raptor legs and featured stubby wings on its back for an extra boost. While its rounded shield and good quality sword told everyone that its main role was a knight, the Drake also featured two strange elongated boxes on its shoulders. Did you put together your own shoulder-mounted lasers? What was wrong with using the readily available ones? Carlos asked in confusion. The ones from the junk pile don't bite hard enough. Oh. The shoulder mounts look like they weigh a lot. Is your mech able to handle all of it? That's why I went with the raptor legs in the first place. They are able to maintain their speed better even when carrying a bigger burden. Yeah, but they're made for raptor mechs in specific. The balance of your half-humanoid mech must be hell. I spent some time adjusting its default modes, and I'm sure Hans can handle the rest. That's a lot of trust you're putting in the test pilot. Indeed he did. While Vase was able to accomplish a lot in 12 hours, he couldn't optimize the balance of the mech completely. He hoped that with Hans' experience in piloting all kinds of mechs would come to good use here. And from the look of the Drake's fluent gait, he encountered no insurmountable problems. The clipped flight system came brilliantly to life. Hans took advantage of its diminished output to put an extra spring in his steps. At certain moments, the Drake moved faster than light mechs even as it weighed as much as the heavier medium mechs. While it wasn't able to avoid detection due to the heat it generated, it was able to outrun a couple of groups. When the Drake encountered an ambush of 2 heavy mechs and a smattering of other weight classes, Hans aggressively charged closer despite the disparity in firepower. The large round shield drew most of the firepower, allowing the Drake to come closer enough to make a few quick attacks with his sword that disabled most of the vulnerable weapon mounts on the heavy mechs. Having taken care of the heavy firepower, Hans darted back and forth and dueled the more mobile mechs at their terms. With the wings acting as jump jets, the Drake was often able to close the distance abruptly with the enemy. While the laser cannons suffered from poor accuracy and tracking, if the Drake came close enough, the damage they caused always slowed down the opponent, softening them up for a lethal sword blow. The Drake progressed forward on a bloody path. Unfortunately, the constant activation of both its flight system and laser cannons rapidly built up heat while draining the mech's energy. FaZe wasn't worried about the energy, as he had packed the Drake with enough energy cells to last the entire gauntlet. Heat was a very different problem, and once the Drake neared its limit, its effectiveness would drop drastically. Heat accumulation troubled designers ever since the first mechs came into existence. Even after 400 years of mech development, modern mechs still face the plain old dilemma of balancing power and heat. Newer power reactors outputted higher amounts of energy, while energy cells packed more and more capacity with each new iteration. Heat absorption and heat dissipation technology only barely kept up with the times. Air was a very poor conductor of heat. This was a good thing for some people, as it meant their coffees and soups wouldn't cool down to room temperature in seconds. For mechs, this presented a big problem, as even the most effective passive radiators could do so much in normal Terran standard air conditions that so many worlds had terraformed into. It was worse in locations of low air and vacuum conditions like on lifeless moons. The biggest advancement in heat dissipation happened about 300 years ago. The first heavy mechs introduced primarily used missile and ballistic weaponry. Their ammunition took a lot of space, but they generated much less heat than pure energy-based weapons like lasers. A heavy mech built in with lots of lasers was seen as an unrealistic fantasy by most mech insiders at the time. As long as they kept shooting their lasers for a couple of minutes, their mechs turned so hot you could cook an egg on its surface. Out comes a mech designer who one day thought while mechs were not so good at dissipating heat into the air, then what about the ground? Their feet always touched the ground. So the mech designer reworked the internals of a mech and basically reinvented the concept of legs not just as a way of moving and a way to support weight, but also as a tool to help mechs transfer heat into the ground. Through incorporating sophisticated heat-conducting alloys, that brilliant mech designer developed revolutionary new legs with widened feet that could actually siphon off heat pretty decently. Shortly after this bombshell invention got out, other mech developers got into the action. If 2 legs conducted this amount of heat, what about 4 legs? The first quadrupedal mechs were born. These so-called animal and centaur mechs looked highly unusual, but having more legs offered many advantages besides increased heat transfer. The introduction of spider mechs followed quickly after, but that was when the whole leg craze peaked. The one man who tried to design a centipede mech failed miserably, and his abomination was quickly forgotten. Methods to deal with heat had come a long way since then. From the use of evaporating coolants, to the incorporation of replaceable heat sinks, mech designers had more choice in how to handle this problem. FaZe hadn't included any of that in his mech. Worse, as Hans often hopped and glided around, the Drake's feet wasn't touching the ground, thus further limiting its heat dissipation. Hans kept avoiding the heavy mechs with his mobility while cutting down the medium mechs by jumping close and taking them out with his sword and shield. Only the light mechs posed a problem as the laser cannons couldn't be fired too fast in order to avoid overheating the Drake. Worse, the laser fire the Drake received only increased its heat levels. About 7 kilometers through the gauntlet, Hans decided it was enough and detached the laser mounts and stubby flight system from the Drake. The mech lost a lot of its mobility and ranged options, but at least its heat generation was cut. Through a mix of clever positioning and a lot of running, Hans was able to pilot his lightened Drake through several blockades. The entire crowd adopted strange expressions when they saw Hans kept surviving ambush after ambush. The Drake often slipped past by the skin of its teeth, its exterior armor and its shield accumulating more and more holes and burn mark chaos. Yet despite the extensive damage, none of them hit anything critical. Hans was somehow able to keep going with the Drake even when the mechs of other contestants would have malfunctioned at this point. Damn son, did you really spend just 12 hours on your mech? It's still going strong. I haven't done a thing. FaZe helplessly shrugged his shoulders. I was on the stage just as you. It's not even possible for me to cheat. Maybe you got word of the competition format beforehand. This must be why Patricia aced the qualifiers. Did the 2 of you do some unspeakable actions in order to get an advantage? FaZe really hadn't cheated. He behaved so scrupulously ever since he arrived at Bentheim that he never once opened the system on his comm. The city was really too crowded, so there were many people of all sorts of affiliations spying on each other. He didn't trust the hotel, the wireless net signals, or even the open air to be clear of spying eyes. Meanwhile, the gauntlet reached the endgame as the finish line was in sight. Hans valiantly squeezed the Drake through many tight spots, though his enemies accumulated at his heels. The light mechs posed a great problem to him as they were impossible to shake off for long. Only through taking creative routes such as crashing through thin structures could Hans stay ahead of the baying wolves. Its shield blocked so many shots and sword attacks that it collapsed at a critical moment when the Drake defended against a pair of knights. While Hans crippled the left knight, the right mech was able to hack off the undefended shield arm. The Drake explosively retreated in order to buy time for Hans to adjust his mech's posture. He was barely able to escape getting enveloped by hopping inside a large parking complex. Vei's heart dropped at the crippling blow. While the Drake already made it far into the gauntlet, he wasn't certain it would be enough to pass the qualifier. Besides prodigies like Patricia and Edwin, there were at least 5 other geniuses who graduated from renowned institutions of second-rate states competing. Come on, Hans. You can do it. He gripped his fist, hoping that his efforts in incorporating the X-Factor in the Drake could make a difference, even if he hadn't noticed anything so far. The Drake remained immobile as Hans tried to vent as much heat as possible during the pause. The mech stopped glowing in the dark, and the reduced heat slightly increased all of the mech's parameters. As Hans mentally prepared for the end sprint, a group of light mechs abruptly sniffed him out of the parking lot. The powerful raptor legs exploded into action. The Drake took the light mechs by surprise by hopping into range, letting the mech ruthlessly cut them down with a couple of quick sword strikes. The Drake bashed aside the falling mechs and ran out into the streets. Dozens of mechs converged around the Drake. No matter where Hans turned, he always confronted at least 4 or 5 mechs. As his maneuvering space got smaller, the enemies achieved more hits. His armor flaked off and his power reactor started to sputter. However, the engines were well protected, so they kept running at full tilt while the Drake's powerful raptor legs maintained a steady gait even with half of its armor in tatters. Hans hacked and slashed at his opposition with unprecedented ferocity. He even started kicking and shoulder bashing the mechs in his way, all to create openings to escape. The amount of mechs that crowded around him grew so large that they started to block each other's efforts. The Drake, desperate to break through the mob of mechs, sprinted forwards and used its powerful legs to jump. The sudden action practically broke the remainder of the mech's leg armor. The Drake landed awkwardly atop a puzzled mech, crunching it with the weight of a mech's fall. It opened up sufficient space for Hans to slip past and reach the last 100 meters of the gauntlet. A sniper round cut the unarmored ankle of the Drake, finally felling the mech at the last moment. Everyone let out gasps of appreciation and disappointment. The Drake managed to come so far, outshining almost every other contestant. However, its scores took a big hit if it failed to reach the end of the gauntlet, which was a giant pity. Not yet. It's not done yet. Vase thought as he gripped his fists so tight he squeezed all of the blood out. He kept mentally praying for Hans to pull a miracle. There's still more you can do with a single leg. It turned out that the Drake wasn't out of the picture yet. Amazingly, the mech threw away its sword and bent forward. It used its single remaining arm to support the mech's upper body. Hans awkwardly piloted the 2-limbed mech forward. Its intact leg hopped forward with powerful force, while the arm kept the mech's forward portion from crashing on the ground. With each misaligned hop, the mech awkwardly neared the finish line even though the arm took more damage from the stresses of carrying so much weight. The sniper shot again, this time taking off half the Drake's arm. Hans couldn't avoid falling forward, yet he kept fighting defeat by practically crawling his mech forward. Only several meters separated victory from defeat, and even as other mechs fired potshots at the Drake, the crippled mech wriggled its remaining leg in a way that allowed the Drake to slide past the line. The entire crowd was speechless. Even the presenter looked dumbfounded at the Drake's incredible integrity and Hans' brilliant performance. Contestant Faze Lerkinson has designed a magnificent piece of work. The Drake has officially conquered the gauntlet. Congratulations. The applause Vase received reached the level of Patricia's. Many contestants and spectators looked at him with a renewed eye. This gratified Vase, though he didn't let the praising contestants coming up to congratulate him get to his head. He participated in this contest in order to make himself known to potential customers. Already Vase started to eye the couple of servicemen and mercenaries in the crowd. It's not time yet. Let's wait until I officially pass the qualifiers. Most of the other mechs that went through the gauntlet after that failed to excite the crowd. It trudged on, and besides the contestants whose mechs were on display, Vase was growing bored. He had seen most of the varieties of mechs by now, and many designers failed to think out of the box, resulting in many similar mechs coming out one after another. Well, if Vase hadn't benefited from the system, he'd probably design a similarly crappy mech as well with his once horrible 0.3 creativity score. After a couple of excitements involving the mechs designed by the geniuses, the end results were clear. The presenter enthusiastically announced the 8 lucky designers that could go onto the main stage of the YTE this afternoon. And the 6th place goes to Faze Larkinson. Congrats, pal. I already knew you'd win. Carlos hugged Faze tightly. Vase kept a small smile on his face as he basked in his first victory. If he couldn't make it this far with the help of the system, he had no reason to be here in the first place. It was a sure thing to pass the qualifiers. As for the main event, he was not so sure. Both Edwin and Patricia were strong, while the rest of the contestants who studied abroad couldn't be underestimated either. Still, 2 of them slipped up during the qualifications, causing Hans to fail before he reached the end of the gauntlet with their mechs. The next phase of the design contest happened in the afternoon while the mech pilot competition ended its semifinals. The start of the design competition would be put on the front stage in front of a live audience of thousands. His face and image would also be projected to the rest of the Bright Republic, which was an unprecedented glory for him as he never really excelled in anything before. He sighed at the happenings. No wonder so many of my colleagues chase after fame and fortune. It not only feels great, it's also good for business. While the crowd started to disperse, Faze already turned on his meager business charm as he walked over a group of idle mercenaries. Hopefully he could generate some interest for his product to these battle-hardened men and women. Chapter 35. Despite turning on the charm, Vase only managed to generate non-committal interest for his mech. He expected it to be a challenge, but the soldiers and mercenaries all treated him like a fly. Oh, the potentates were polite about it, but the disdain and dismissal was clear in their eyes. His status as a promising young mech designer who just got through the qualifiers meant nothing to them. He lacked the opportunity to show off the Mark Antony as they brushed him aside after a minute of polite talk. My apologies, my department is not in a hurry to procure a new mech. Our budget is tight. We don't make a lot of profit per operation. We can barely keep our mechs afloat. I'll look into your products a couple of years later when our current fleet of mechs needs replacements. The crew I'm running already trained in a specific configuration of mechs. Introducing a different type of mech will disrupt the balance. I'm not specialized in melee combat. A mech that uses a mace and shield is not suitable to an unskilled pilot like me. The excuses sounded the same no matter where Faze tried to find a customer. As the people left the venue in order to grab a bite or visit the main event in the central stadium, Faze was left with empty hands. Hello there, Vase. He turned around to see an unexpected sight. Hans came up and addressed him personally. Hans. What brings you here? I just want to let you know that out of all the mechs I've piloted today, yours is one of the few who took the comfort of the pilot into account. Vase raised his eyebrow. This was definitely the X factor at work. I design my mechs with the user in mind. My products are more than the sum of its parts. I put my heart into each of my designs. I've refined my craft by designing and producing many mechs for Iron Spirit, where I've enjoyed a substantial amount of sales. I'm currently trying to branch out my real-world business. That sounded professional enough, right? The pilot nodded and looked interested. I'd like to see more of your work. Ah. Vase quickly activated his comm to swipe his virtual sales page to Hans. My digital storefront is here. Please feel free to browse my wares, though I advise you to look at my Mark Antony variant first. It's based off the Caesar Augustus, but I've reworked it extensively with more affordable armor. This is also the design that I'm offering for sale from my Real Universe workshop. You are able to produce a variant of the Augustus. Hans sharpened his eyes a bit at that news. I don't know much about the business, but I do know that the production license alone must cost an incredible sum of money. How could you get a hold of such a premium license? I've been fortunate to attract the attention of some people who took note of my talent in mech design. Vase said as he shamelessly weaved a tale of bullshit in order to cover up the existence of the system. A renowned Rubarthan grant institution even granted me a couple of production licenses to give my startup a push. That is impressive. It is not easy to attract the attention of the Rubarthans. Don't misunderstand me. The institution is only based in the new Rubarthan Empire, probably for financial and privacy reasons. The real owners probably have a more modest origin. As for their exact identities, I'm not sure, but with such deep pockets they certainly have clout. Vase chose to steer the conversation in a risky way. By not so subtly talking about the non-existent rich people behind his back, he was weaving an illusion of having the support of a mysterious and powerful backer. While rich people often like to waste their money, they never threw away their wealth to useless people. Vase therefore implied that he possessed a unique talent in mech design that distinguished him from the hundreds of other contestants who took part in the qualifications. The fact that it was one of the few truths he tried to convey helped sway Hans over. The man rubbed his blonde stubble. "You're an interesting fellow. I'll keep my eye on you." Hans stepped past Vase and exited the building. Vase felt as if his tricks were seen through somehow, but then he shrugged. Whether Hans committed to looking up the Mark Antony in the game was more important. Gee, at least give me a solid answer instead of letting me hang. He left the building and joined Carlos for dinner at one of the many eating venues available. As Vase took a bite out of a meat pie, Carlos enviously gazed at his friend who seemed to be reborn ever since they graduated. "I feel like you took everyone's luck except Patricia for attracting such a ridiculous grant. Come on, how many billions of credits does the Caesar Augustus license sell these days?" Vase shrugged again and again as he denied any wrongdoing. "I really don't have a sugar mommy, let alone a daddy. You know I don't swing that way." Puff. "Give me a couple of million credits and I'll gladly go down on my knees no matter how old and smelly." "Ugh, thank you for that image. I still haven't finished my lunch." When Vase described his difficulties getting his first sale, Carlos shook his head. "You haven't grown up here in Durham, so you don't have a good picture of the people who buy mechs. You're expecting too much out of the mech corps and the mercenary corps. Forget about selling a private mech to a government mech. They have no decision-making power in the spending of their units. They pilot whatever mechs the brass shoves at them. As for their private lives, no serviceman has enough credits hanging around to buy a mech for off-duty use, at least not before they are retired." "And the mercenaries?" Vase asked, feeling rather grateful Carlos was willing to lay it all down for him. He wasn't a local of Bentheim, so his knowledge about the business mainly came from textbooks. Their finances are tightly regulated. A good contract can set them up with a couple of millions, but a bad luck streak might wipe out tens or even hundreds of millions of credits off their balance sheet. Sure, they have a large stash of credits in the bank, but that's their plan B, or in the worst case their retirement fund. From Carlos' words, there was still a small chance Vase could push his product on them, but it had to be worth spilling their savings. "So I have the best chance if I approach retirees or those close to retirement?" "That's a decent angle to take. The old guys who retire from active duty can't scratch their itches unless they hop into a real cockpit. The popular simulation such as Iron Spirit is too casual and fake to satisfy their needs. Don't underestimate the pensions they earned in their years of service. Mech pilots were hard to come by, and their services were important in securing locations and projecting power. They earned a nice share of wealth of whatever it was they were defending of attacking as taxes or protection fee. It was an accepted reality in human space that the fist trumped over laws. Only the fact that the Bright Republic was just a poor, third-rate state kept it from being embroiled in constant wars over territory. A lot of money exchanged hands whenever mechs took to the field. However, most of it got spent on maintaining the mechs and paying off other expenses. "I do have an idea," Carlos said as he finished his burrito. "You should try to approach the rich guys, in particular the collectors. They love collecting unusual mechs and admire them for hours in their private mech stables. Some of them aren't even potentates. They just love the feel of owning unique mechs." Vase thought his chances there were bigger. "That's a good angle, but they're often inapproachable, right? If you're some average hobo, then yeah, the security won't let you come close. But what if you're the winner of the Young Tigers exhibition? Collectors love unearthing gems in the rough. If they can snap up the very first handmade mech of a budding mech designer with bright prospects, they don't care about the piddling millions of credits they have to throw at you. It's peanuts compared to the potential collector's value when you become a household name in the Republic." This was a tall order for Vase to fulfill. This year's competition was incredibly tough, and even he couldn't guarantee victory against 7 other talented geniuses. It all depended on the format of this afternoon's competition. After finishing their dinners, they walked over to the gigantic stadium at the center of the exhibition. A large crowd of fans cheered as they saw their favorite pilots triumph over their opponents. It took quite a bit of squeezing for Carlos and Vase to reach the crowded entrance. The security portal let both of them pass without issue once they identified themselves as mech designers who participated in the design competition. It was a nice freebie given to them by the organizers. A regular ticket to attend the competition in person reached in the tens of thousands of credits. The well-planned layout of the interior of the stadium allowed the two young designers to get a glimpse of the excitement all around. Through the clever use of height and depth, the entire venue was transformed into a three-dimensional set of arenas where spectators could sit and watch the matches safely from above. Highly durable protective screens protected the onlookers from incidental projectiles and impacts, though the violence still led to some frightening moments. The Young Tigers exhibition introduced the true world of mechs to its visitors. Vase gobbled it all up like a junkie getting his fix. He eagerly approached the nearest arena battle, showcasing a tense sword duel between two nearly identical medium mechs. Both of them had been at it for a while, damaging their shields to such an extent that they were forced to throw it away. The red mech, piloted by a talent from Bentheim, circled around the purple mech painted in the livery of an academy in Rittersburg. The two core planets of the Bright Republic often competed against each other in any field imaginable, from sports to mech competitions like this. The usual stereotypes were that the people of Rittersburg were polite and stuffy, while Bentheimers were cosmopolitan and greedy. However, when one met the other, they both turned into raving madmen eager to put the other down a notch. As a native of Cloudy Curtain, Vase had no stake in the match. Even though he studied at Rittersburg, he possessed no sense of belonging of that beautiful but ultimately elitist planet. As for Carlos, he felt a bit torn between rooting for his home planet or the planet where he spent much of his time partying. Shit, who's going to win? Carlos bit his lips. Neither of them were pilots, nor did they possess the aptitude to become one. Their knowledge on mech fights largely came from entertainment and the occasional classwork in college. Vase only possessed a slight advantage over Carlos due to his Larkinson military family background. The Bentheimer is a bit too impatient. Vase judged as he took in the tempo of the match. Both sides looked evenly matched, but his eyes discerned a little bit more due to his studies of the X Factor. It left him more sensitive to the emotions of the pilots running the mechs. He thinks he's running out of time. The longer the wait, the more the Rittersberger is accumulating strength. The Bentheimer is trying to find an opening before his opponent erupts. The blue mech sporting Bentheim's planetary symbol darted forward and poked with his sword. The Rittersberger refused to take the bait, slipping back just out of range. The two mechs continued to circle around as they let the anticipation among the crowd grow. The purple mech took the blue mech by surprise as it jumped forward. The mech from Bentheim hastily parried the sword slash, only to receive a punch on the mech's face when it tried to retreat. The disruption of the mech's main sensors gave the Rittersberger enough of an opening to stab his sword past its defenses. As the tip of the sword touched the armor plate just in front of the cockpit, both mechs immediately immobilized. The safeties had engaged, bringing the match to an end in favor of the purple mech. That was a good show. Vase commented with appreciation. The Rittersberger had a great grasp of timing. He struck when the Bentheimer thought he was in for the long haul. Carlos shook his head as he looked perplexed. Dunno. The guy from Bentheim should slap himself for letting his opponent get close enough to deliver that punch. They took the time to spectate the other matches, enjoying the visceral feel of real mechs clashing against each other with the naked eye. Experiencing such mech battles personally was a treat, and Vase improved his understanding of mechs every time he watched the pilots exert their mechs to the utmost. After having his fill of mech battles, Vase parted with Carlos and reached the backstage area. After a stern search by security, an attendant guided him to a waiting room where the 7 other finalists of the mech design competition waited. None of them smiled or took any note of Vase. Only Patricia gave him a second look, and it was more of the likes of recognizing a tiny mouse that scurried underneath her feet now and then. The group hadn't acknowledged him, which suited him fine. A lull appeared as the sounds of weapons fire and crashing mechs ceased. A couple of attendants exhorted the mech designers to get ready to step onto the main stage. An announcer introduced the upcoming event. Citizens of the Republic. I hope you have enjoyed the clashes happening so far. I certainly have. Well, if you think we're holding the quarterfinals next, then be prepared because we have something special to introduce to you this year. The projectors behind the announcer lighted up in a collage of mech designers and fabricators working diligently on their mechs. A good pilot can't do without a good mech. For every pilot on the field, there are at least 10 to 20 people supporting him from behind. It is at the hands of mech designers that a new mech comes to life. We here at the Young Tigers exhibition wish to do our part in honoring this important profession. Now, let me introduce the 8 brightest mech designers of the year. The 8 of them stepped forward onto the stage. The audience gave them a polite applause. There was modest interest in their appearance, but they'd rather go back to seeing mechs bash their heads against each other. After a brief bow, the announcer detailed the upcoming contest. I'm sure it's fascinating to see our budding engineers tinker with machinery, but it can get a little tedious if they go on for days. We've taken your comments to heart about last year's event and decided to put a new spin on the format this year. Uh-oh, that didn't sound so good, Faze thought. The announcer let the anticipation build up a little before detailing the mech design competition. As you know, many talented pilots have the opportunity to show off their skill on stage. Where there are winners, there are also losers. Mech warfare can be a cruel business, but what if some of our pilots have a second chance? Are you willing to see them compete in a separate bracket? Most of the crowd cheered enthusiastically. Many pilots competing today lost their chances to reach the quarterfinals. Many fans hoped their underdogs could shine on the stage once again. We've come up with the Fusion Cup. 8 eliminated pilots with the best scores will receive the opportunity to work together with these 8 fine ladies and gentlemen on the stage. It will be the first competition in this side of human space where both pilot and designer compete jointly for the top and win the prestigious cup. A two-tone tournament cup appeared on the stage. It was gold on one side, and silver on the other side. A small partition in between showed that both halves of the cup could be put together or remain separate. The projection behind the announcer highlighted 2 lists of names. One set contained the names of the pilots, and on the other the names of the designers. A lot of people looked confused, but that didn't diminish their enthusiasm. Faze tried to maintain his easy smile to present an image that there was nothing wrong. However, inside his mind he was already churning his brain on the competition format. So what are they competing on? Well, for the pilot, it remains the same. Just enter the cockpit and wallop their opponent on stage. The key is what kind of mech they are piloting. We wouldn't involve the designers if they have nothing to do. So can you guess what kind of role they can play in the short 6 hours that they have until the matches start? 6 hours was way too short to create a mech from actual parts. Faze thought the competition might happen in a virtual space, which would be a shame as he'd miss out valuable experience in building up a real mech. The pilots won't be changing the mechs they last piloted. Only the most critically damaged components such as the difficult-to-replace engines have been replaced. This allows the mech designer to repair and tune up the mech using the various tools and resources available, courtesy to the mech core. You will be able to see with your own 2 eyes how pilots and designers can work together to reinvent their mechs like phoenixes rising from their ashes. Thousands of cheers and applause thundered the stadium as the crowd lapped up the new concept. However, Faze looked a little troubled. He was used to depending on himself. Now he had to work together to repair and modify another pilot's mech. What if their opinions clashed? The fortunes of the designer and the pilot are tied together. Winning for both the pilot and designer will depend on which mech reaches first place in combat. If the designer does a bad job, then the pilot can do nothing even if he puts 200% in his piloting. On the other hand, if the pilot is having a bad day, then it doesn't matter if the mech turned into a juggernaut. A couple of boos sounded out from those remarques. What? You think it's unfair? Well, so what? The real world isn't fair. However, we've made efforts to match the 2 groups of people based on their previous performances. The top-scoring pilot will be matched with the top-scoring designer from their qualifiers. The second-best pilot is partnered with the second-best designer and so on. Though their starting points are the same, what the pairs accomplish together is still up in the air. The 8 pilots participating in the Fusion Cup took their turn to take the stage. The pilots were directed to the partners who took over responsibility over their mechs. As the 6th scoring mech designer, Faze got paired with a native of Bentheim called Charlotte Hofmeister. The wiry, dirty blonde-haired woman was built like a leopard, and seemed to regard him that way as well with the narrowed eyes scanning his skinny form. He felt as if the young woman dismissed him as a threat. Hi. I'm Faze Lerkinson. The woman's phoenix eyes narrowed at his introduction. You don't look like a Lerkinson. Not everyone in my family is a potentate. Faze helplessly shrugged. Whatever. Just fix up my Kirby and don't mess things up. Lerkinson or not, I'll string you by the balls if you cost me my revenge. After prying a bit more information from the taciturn woman, Faze learned that Charlotte suffered a humiliating loss against her rival Miranda Del Rey, who is now the second-ranked pilot in the competition. She wanted to take advantage of her second chance on the stage to give her rival a comeuppance. Damn it, that's Patricia's partner. Faze grumbled. The second-best pilot paired with the second-best mech designer made for a very formidable pair of opponents. I'll have to put in all my effort and more something special if I want to make it that far. Everyone went to the improvised workshops that the organizers put up in the unused side arenas. The wrecked mechs the pilots used already rested on a lifting platform. When Faye saw Charlotte's Kirby, his heart dropped to the bottom of his stomach. Your Kirby is a heavy mech. Yup. The woman smiled with obvious affection. It's the best damn partner a girl could ask for. He's been my buddy since my final year in the academy. The Kirby was an actual fact a Raisling incorporated turbofire RTF 581. The turbofire was built around the concept of overwhelming mid-range firepower. At the time, it was an excellent fire support mech that provided a powerful amount of suppressive firepower in the battlefield. It was not a mech suitable for arena duels. The organizers knew this, and came up with a long list of demands ever since the first few YTE resulted in severe injuries. The firepower of all projectile weapons were reduced substantially. In return, melee attacks also got reduced in power by lowering the mech's arm power. Naturally, the latter could be circumvented by putting the weight of the entire mech in the blow. This also resulted in melee dominating over ranged weapons in the tournament, which Faye supposed was the intention of the organizers. Too much firepower strained the protective screen that kept the spectators safe from the explosions. In any case, Faye's had to get this lumbering, bipedal gun platform in working condition in just 6 hours. This might not sound like a problem, but when he saw what Miranda Del Rey did to it, he practically despaired. The turbofire's legs both suffered amputations, which led to the scrapping of both whole legs. In addition, the rest of the mech service sported nefariously thin sword marqueas, which made it easy to exploit the damaged sections. This is going to take a lot of work to fix up, Vase said grimly. Luckily enough, he shored up just enough of his skills to conduct the repairs within a decent amount of time. The only problem was that he could only work on the most critical parts, and leave the cracks in the armor alone due to lack of time. Heavy mechs demanded a lot more resources and time with regards to maintenance and repair. This was one of the reasons why light and medium mechs significantly outnumber the heavy mechs in service. Vase tried to discuss making some modifications to the mech to make it more viable to the limited range arena format. No, absolutely not. A sword or a mace really helps out if the enemy gets close. Zip it, nerd boy. I don't want to tarnish my Kirby by using him as a caveman. Helplessly, Vase dropped the topic for now. Charlotte adamantly insisted on maintaining her tactic of pouring overwhelming firepower at the enemy before they could get into range. This worked great against inexperienced opponents, but as her thrashing against Miranda revealed, skilled pilots had answers to this one pony trick. Very well, I'll go work on your mech and get it up to working condition. He had more ideas, but thought it prudent to keep his mouth shut. He got the measure of Charlotte now and knew he couldn't get a word through her stubborn mouth. It frustrated him a little that the organizers forced him to work with an uncooperative client. Everything they did in the competition was broadcasted live to the rest of the Republic. If Vase and Charlotte lost at the first round, they'd end up as laughingstocks. Never mind finding a customer for his Mark Antony, all the pilots would simply laugh at him for failing so drastically on stage. The Kirby took a long of wrangling to get into an optimal position to replace the legs. In his own workshop, such a job took days, of which most of the time was spent on fabricating the huge legs. Fortunately, in the interest of speeding things along, the organizers provided a number of parts along with nearly state-of-the-art fabrication tools. The cost of the 3D printer and assembler was worth at least 5 times more than the second-hand goods back home in Cloudy Curtain. This is the power the government has at hand. Vase thought ruefully as he started to inspect the damaged underside of the Kirby. Any small mech designer will just get crushed if it tries to compete against the wealth of an entire state. He shook his head and even slapped both of his cheeks. He needed to get his head in the game and avoid any distraction. I wonder if I can impart some X-Factor magic with my repairs. Theory made it possible, but frankly Vase was dubious it could work this time. The organizers already fabricated and supplied most of the parts, which meant he had no opportunity to build up a mech using parts he designed and fabricated on his own in a significant amount. Still, he spent his time refocusing his thoughts in order to keep a narrow intention in mind. I want to make the Kirby a worthy partner for Charlotte. This was the angle he went for. Charlotte obviously already developed affection for her mech and piloted it for an extended time. If he could reinforce that connection in a minute way, it might mean the difference between victory and defeat. With the help of the loaders, Vase was able to get the mech into a position to remove the useless remains of the upper legs. He turned the assembler machine into disassemble mode, which allowed him to gently pry off the legs and clear the sockets underneath the torso of any remaining debris. The installation of the new legs went smoothly. He selected a pair of legs identical to the old ones from the limited selection available. He had no reason to change the model of the legs. Attaching them to the Kirby was similar to assembling the legs of a new mech, though there were a couple of differences. The most important was that the internal frame needed to be attached perfectly to the legs. While Vase had done such things many times in Iron Spirit, doing it for real on stage brought about immense pressure. Still, the legs attached perfectly to the mech in the end. It helped that Vase avoided thinking negative thoughts by adamantly adhering to his intentions. He wanted to seriously repair and tweak the Kirby until it became a great tool of destruction in the hands of Charlotte. Maintaining mental discipline allowed him to work on his mech in a calm fashion, which slightly impressed the spectating crowd. As the mech designers quietly worked on restoring the functionality of the mechs, the quarter-finals of the IT continued. Only one match took place at a time, which had the effect of drawing most of the spectators away to the main arena. The people who watched the matches only turned around and looked at the mech designers busy in their work as the matches ended and the new one had yet to start. Hours passed by as Vase diligently used his knowledge in mechanics and what he learned from the system to make repairs. He replaced faulty bolts and other minor parts and tested to see if any of the components needed replacing, as the main sensor did, as it sported a hairline crack. After that, he tackled the fractured heavy armor of the mech. This was a tricky problem. The right thing to do was to replace the damaged armor plates with newly fabricated ones, but that took days. He could either crudely bolt over the cracks with additional plates, which unnecessarily thickened the armor and burdened the mech, or he could fabricate a special armor solution that he could use to fill up the cracks. Both solutions weren't ideal, so he asked for Charlotte's opinion. Just fill up the cracks. Don't you dare put more weight on my Kirby. I need my mobility for something special I have planned to get back at that bitch Miranda. Vase could only follow Charlotte's decision. Personally, he thought that if Charlotte insisted on sticking to her ranged weapon focus, it was better to turn her mech into an armored firing platform. Too bad her obsessive hatred of Miranda gave Charlotte a phobia of turning into a sitting duck again. She wanted Vase to install a couple of knife holsters onto her Kirby, as if she could actually wield them with her heavy mech's sluggish arms. It'd be like a bear trying to play table tennis. He worked quietly to fulfill the basic needs of the Kirby. After filling in most of the holes and finishing a quick weld to affix the holsters onto the mech's hips, Vase noted he had less than 2 hours of time to make a single substantial change to the mech. He considered making adjustments to the mech's formidable laser and ballistic weapon loadout, but he hadn't received permission from Charlotte to tweak such a fundamental aspect of her mech. I can overload the lasers and intensify the programming on the shells of the Kirby's weapon mounts. It'll wear down the weapons drastically, but it can give the guns a good boost in power even if the competition technicians already neutered their power once. Naturally, the rules of the competition explicitly forbid reversing the safety measures, but there were many ways of increasing the prowess of a weapon. The problem was if he asked Charlotte for permission, she'd just shoot him down again. Vase felt tempted to just bypass the smoldering woman and let her deal with his work in the arena. It's better to ask for forgiveness than beg for permission. Most of his instincts called for going through to do what was nagging on his mind and therefore increasing the odds of success. But there are billions of people watching this competition. Can I do something this despicable in broad daylight? Also, what would Charlotte think of him? He'd be betraying her trust. He constantly focused on his purpose to make the Kirby a good mech for Charlotte. If he wanted to follow this creed in good faith, then he had to keep in mind that what he thought was a good mech might not be what Charlotte preferred. Also, if he dared pull this trick when billions of people were watching the YTE, he might never enjoy a good reputation in the Bright Republic ever again. He had to perform scrupulously proper on stage if he wanted to attract future customers. Vase eventually firmed up as he stuck to principles. I'll ask for permission first. Charlotte glowered at him. Are you FC King kidding me? No. I won't sacrifice my Kirby's long-term health for a short-term boost. Only scum do those kinds of things. No matter how many times Vase tried to explain it, the pilot kept sticking to her stance. He understood then that to Charlotte, her Kirby's health was more important than even getting one up over the hated Miranda. Maybe we've gone off the wrong foot. Let's try this a different way. Vase said in a conciliatory tone. Tell me more about your Kirby. Why do you want to know that? Charlotte looked at him with suspicion. We've got 2 hours of time left and maybe I can make a few tweaks here and there if you'd let me. The only way I can do that is if I know more about the mech and be able to suggest improvements in line with your thoughts. Though she showed she still had misgivings about it, when it came to her mech, she felt better if she bragged about the Kirby. I won the top marksmanship prize in the Academy tournament. They loaned me the Kirby as the first place prize. It's the best mech I've ever piloted so far. He's an old training mech, but he's got the best specs among the heavies in terms of firepower. Charlotte went on and on as she gushed about the mech's substantial firepower. She really obsessed over the ability to turn an enemy mech into Swiss cheese before they even reached her. Vase thought the reason why she personalized the Kirby so much wasn't because she considered the mech a person, but that its weapon loadout featured tons more firepower than all the other piddling mechs she practiced with. In her words, those smaller medium and light mechs were pansies. I think I see what you want. Vase nodded his head. Your training mech is a great fire support mech, but Miranda is going to destroy you with her sword again if you go on stage with the same mech. You have to plug your vulnerability to close-ranged mechs if you want to stand a chance of winning the cup. I don't want you ruining my Kirby. No, I've got something different in mind. I'd like to install some temporary additions to the Kirby. What do you say about bolting more guns to the Kirby's frame? The prospect of even more guns exciting Charlotte a bit, and after Vase detailed his plans based on the Kirby's build and the available parts, she enthusiastically gave her approval. As a turbofire model, its design had proven itself over the years as a sturdy and reliable way to deliver heavy firepower. It featured a large, stocky bipedal build, allowing it to hide behind hills or structures and fire its weapons over the top without exposing itself excessively. Its main weapons were its two heavy cannons that took the place of the arms. This left the turbofire with a well-integrated pair of weapons that could easily be fired around corners and over other obstacles. Naturally, this also prevented the mech from wielding external weapons such as rifles or swords. Though much of the mech was devoted to supporting the two cannons, the mech also featured twin laser shoulder mounts. Each mount carried 3 medium-powered lasers and normally fired in rapid-fire mode in order to take down missiles and light mechs. The turbofire design incorporated extra-large and extra-sophisticated sensors. Their best feature was their strength and targeting systems, allowing the laser mounts to fire more accurately at fast-moving targets. Charlotte always relied on the autonomous shoulder mounts to take care of rushing mechs. Unfortunately for her, Miranda knew about this detail and confronted the Kirby with a Knight-type mech. The shield was specifically prepared for this arena duel. Hiding behind the reinforced shield, Miranda was able to dodge the heavy cannon shots and shrug off the laser beams long enough to reach Charlotte's rear. As the Kirby lacked any way to turn her weapons around, Miranda had ample opportunity to do all manner of things to the lumbering heavy mech. Even the shoulder mounts couldn't turn around due to their excessive length with the mech's large head in the way. To plug this gaping weakness in the turbofire's design, Vase offered to add a small change to the Kirby. He wanted to add a couple of rear-facing weapons on the Kirby's back. With relatively little experience in this area and only less than 2 hours to accomplish the job, Vase knew it wouldn't look pretty. But right now he needed to impress the crowd, and just sticking to safe and boring repairs wouldn't cut it. The Kirby also deserved better. Mounting weapons on the rear of the mech was a tricky operation. It couldn't be something with a long barrel such as a cannon because the enemy mech could just stand to the side or even cut it off. The weapon should also be limited in weight, or else it could shift the mech's center of gravity too far backwards, making it easy to trip on its back. Lasers could do. There's a couple of smaller mounts available. Still, they don't pack enough of a punch. There was really only one solution. Missiles. The basic ranged weapons available to mechs consisted of 3 separate choices. Laser weapons boasted high accuracy, weighed relatively little and required no physical ammunition. They also slurped energy like a thirsty hog and generated incredible amounts of heat. However, their light speed damage delivery meant that if a mech's sensors were good enough, it could even detonate explosive shells in midair. Ballistic weapons, which included solid projectiles as well as explosive shells, often fired through an electromagnetic barrel. This caused them to consume energy and build up heat, but in a much lesser proportion to lasers. They generally delivered a lot more damage at the cost of accuracy and having to carry around ammunition. Missiles in these days were basically considered self-propelled and self-guided explosive shells. They boasted a substantial amount of firepower and did not require a large and sophisticated weapon platform to launch. The simplest missiles could even be launched from an improvised pipe. They demanded the least in terms of heat, weight, and space out of the mechs, but they were also the most troublesome to reload since they took an incredible amount of space. Still, their ease of delivery made them popular alternatives to ballistic weaponry. These missiles also came in hundreds of different varieties. The most dominant type of missiles were long-range missiles, which could travel at long distances and arrive at a target with pinpoint accuracy as long as it was supplemented with decent targeting. What Phase decided to incorporate in the Kirby's back was something different. Long-range missiles were all fine and dandy, but the close-range nature meant that much of the propellants in the missiles would never be fully utilized. He decided to go with short-range rockets instead. While they didn't possess enough propellant to travel beyond a kilometer of distance, they used up all of the freed space for extra explosives instead, leading to a bigger boom. Their relatively low-tech and self-contained natures meant that mounting the launchers carrying the rockets was as simple as welding a metal box to a surface. Vase installed 3 separate launchers on the Kirby's broad back in a slightly angled, semicircular arrangement. The middle launcher pointed its rocket straight ahead, while the 2 launchers to the side angled a bit to the left and right respectively. This eliminated the Kirby's blind spots. Naturally, the actual installation was a bit more complicated than described, but he still managed to hook up the launcher systems to the Kirby's operating system. Alright, time's up. The first match of the Fusion Cup will commence in a single elimination bracket style. Matches will last at most 20 minutes, after which each mech can be serviced until the time they are called up to the stage again. You won't have too much time between matches, so make the best of your time and conduct only the most essential repairs. The rules of the Fusion Cup posed slightly harsher restrictions compared to the main tournament. In the normal competition, repairs to the mech were always done by a team of professionals. The Fusion Cup placed all responsibility on the mech designer alone. In practice, this meant that Vase could only spend a small of time effecting repairs before Charlotte took the Kirby for another match. Therefore, to make it to the finals, Vase had to make the best use out of a very limited window of time, while Charlotte was forced to defeat her opponent while suffering as little damage as possible. Vase refused to look down on Charlotte's opponents. 5 of them achieved a higher ranking in the main tournament, and all of them were well aware of her fighting style by now, so they could prepare countermeasures. The only good thing about the Fusion Cup's rules was that the announcer revealed the randomized matchups at the end of the modification period. This prevented Charlotte's immediate opponent from bringing in a mech specialized in taking down heavy gunners. The announcer revealed the brackets. As expected, the organizers probably nudged a few things here and there in order to make sure that the first and second place teams faced each other at the finals if they won all the matches. Vase wouldn't be dealing with Edwin and his partner just yet. Instead, their first match surprisingly coincided with what he desperately did not want to see. Let the first match begin. Charlotte Hoffmeister and Miranda Del Rey, please enter the arena. A light and heavy mech both entered the stage. Charlotte's Turbofire's footsteps cracked the surface of the arena with each step due to the additional weight. Though the rear-mounted rockets weighed relatively little, that was only the case compared to other weapons. It made Charlotte's mech into an even bigger sitting duck once its ammunition ran out. Miranda's mech was a statement in elegance. Not unlike the Fantasia, Miranda's training mech looked thin and feminine. With his familiarity with the Fantasia, Vase spotted commonalities that convinced him that Miranda's mech was designed by Kezia Armaments as well. Only this company insisted the most on feminine appearances. Say goodbye to winning, because this lady is going to teach you a lesson. Charlotte taunted as they waited for the ready signal. Heh. Miranda arrogantly trash-talked, not even bothering to keep her conversation private. I whooped your ass once, I'll whoop it again. Oh yeah. Well, I got a few surprises ready. I'll spank you and send you back to your mom if you think you can get the drop on me again. Vase just palmed his face. Why did it seem like he was back in high school? Coincidentally, he looked at Patricia, who looked similarly exasperated. Mech designers possessed cooler minds. They had to in order to endure the mind-numbing texts they had to read. Mech pilots on the other hand favored boldness and intuition. Too much thinking led to hesitation, which was not at all desirable when shells and missiles flew above the pilot's head. In any case, the signal went green. Miranda's female mech exploded into action, moving rapidly in a zigzag motion in order to confuse Charlotte's aim. Her mech's highly advanced ECM systems pumped into action. Other auxiliary systems made their presence known as well. One module caused distortions to appear in the naked eye, the result of a special smoke that hindered optical targeting systems and fed them a whole bunch of garbage data. However, Charlotte showed the audience that she wasn't a heavy gunner specialist for nothing. Without waiting for her targeting systems to punch through Miranda's ECM, she fired her cannons and lasers in a wide spread without fine-tuning her aim. The chaotic spread of laser beams and projectiles failed to hit Miranda, but some of it came close to damaging her just by proximity. Miranda stopped fooling around and circled her way forward at an oblique angle, always making sure she never closed the distance in a direct path that allowed for easy hits. Despite Charlotte's prodigious firepower, none of her weapons hit. Only when Miranda reached halfway did she suffer minor damage to her mech's legs when an explosive shell detonated a bit too close. It peeled a few layers of armor but nothing more. I told you, Charlotte, you'll always be beneath me. Charlotte appeared to have panicked a little and overloaded her laser mounts. The weapons pushed past their maximum cycles and fired until the launchers overheated. Vase winced as he thought how troublesome it was to repair the launchers. Overheating affected laser weapons a bit more severely than other components due to the high demands of integrity the weapons required. If the focusing elements were a little bit off, then what the barrel spat out wasn't a tight beam, but a wide spread that felt more like a tanning machine than a deadly weapon. Miranda suffered a number of hits not just due to the increased frequency of shots but also due to the shorter distance. Getting closer meant her profile grew in Charlotte's targeting vision. This increased the heavy mech's chances of hitting the light mech. However, as Miranda continued to close the distance, the hit rates decreased even as the lasers kept their frantic firing. Her mech sideways dodging increased the amount of degrees Charlotte had to adjust her aim once the distance between the two narrowed. It was like the difference between shooting a clay pigeon 5 meters away and 50 meters away. If the clay pigeon was thrown in the air from a distance, the shooter only needed to shift his weapon a couple of degrees at most to track the projectile. If the clay pigeon flew a lot closer, then the shooter might even be forced to turn his body over 100 degrees single second. Heavy mechs notoriously turned their mech slowly. Even the Turbofire's large but sluggish laser mounts failed to keep up with Miranda's mech. Haha, if you think I'm going to fall for your stupid trick, then think again. My partner's not blind and neither am I. Miranda's mech struck out with her sword as she kept to the sides of Kirby. Faze was afraid of that. While the Kirby posed a lot of threat at its front and rear arcs, the sides could not be covered by any weapons. Patricia must have recognized what Vase cobbled up and reminded Miranda of the threat to Kirby's rear. However, just because Vase was afraid of the option didn't mean he or Charlotte anticipated the action. Vase passed on a tactic he learned from the online adventures of his cousin Melinda to his partner, hoping she could utilize it at the right time. As the sword was about to hit Kirby's arm, Charlotte chose to retaliate by forcefully detaching the nearest laser launcher. The overheated component blocked and foiled Miranda's sword strike, causing the light mech to pause. In the meantime, Charlotte successfully used the time she bought to turn her mech about 45 degrees, enough for one of her rocket launchers to face the gobsmacked feminine mech. The launcher disgorged its entire complement of rockets practically right at point-blank range. What happened if a launcher spat out its entire complement of rockets at once? Something really fantastic and terrible, depending on who you asked. Miranda immediately became aware of the crisis and proved her chops as a young elite by throwing her sword forward while huddling behind her shield with both of her mech's hands, making sure to crouch to present as small of a profile as possible. The sword knocked a couple of rockets aside. Due to the safeties built into the warheads, they failed to detonate early due to their close proximity to the launcher. Instead, they flew or fell to the floor largely inert. As for the other rockets, the upper portion harmlessly flew past the crouching mech while the lower portion exploded harshly against the shield. Due to the decrease in lethality among all projectiles, the rockets failed to penetrate the shield, though they did cause quite a few layers to peel off. The force of the explosions also rocked Miranda's mech backwards. I've got more where that came from. Charlotte taunted as her heavy mech turned another 45 degrees so that her Kirby's back faced her opponent at a straight angle. Miranda got cut off as another volley of missiles came in her direction. She tried to do a roll while keeping her shield forward. This successfully let her avoid most of the rocket barrage, though the lower corner of her shield finally fell apart from the few projectiles that managed to hit it with sufficient force. Before Miranda could celebrate her survival, Charlotte's final launcher disgorged its payload. You moth. The feminine mech finally escaped the last wave with the skin of its teeth. The few rockets that detonated against its armor managed to crater a portion of the chest. It's checkmate for you, Charlotte gloatingly said as she kept turning slowly, allowing her to present her outstretched cannon and laser mount. The weapons at that side spat out a furious salvo that further damaged the bedraggled Miranda and her mech. Damn it, if it wasn't for those stupid rockets, I'd have peeled your limbs off by now. Ever since Miranda dodged further away in order to escape the rockets, she lost the initiative. Her mech needed time to build up speed, and before she built up her momentum, Charlotte got a prime opportunity to sneak in a lot of damage. The Kirby sinisterly aimed at the legs, hoping to impair Miranda's mobility. A lucky high-explosive cannon shell managed to detonate close to the legs, which stripped off the rest of the armor of the female mech's feet. The force of the small explosion also unbalanced Miranda's gait, causing her to lose crucial speed. Alright, I wanted to save this for the finals, but you leave me no choice now. Let me show you what Patricia gifted my mech. Uh-oh. Vase bit his lip as Miranda finally took the match seriously. He knew that Miranda always kept something in reserve, as a mech designer as renowned as Patricia wouldn't just let her partner go out in a boring stock mech. The female mech's back armor opened up to reveal a stubby flight system. Vase almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. That F-seeking Patricia stole my design. Patricia not only stole his idea, she improved upon it. She expanded and sloped the back armor in a way that freed up space while not making it obvious a miniature flight system was attached in that location. The amount of engineering it took to create such a hidden surprise boggled Vase's mind. He had to admit that Patricia possessed terrifying competence. Miranda's mech ceased to care for its damaged legs as the compact flight system allowed it to travel above the floor with sufficient speed. The light mech's ability to dodge improved substantially. After building up sufficient speed, it flew towards the Kirby for a second showdown. Charlotte gritted her teeth inside the cockpit. Her rear armor was burdened with empty rocket launchers. Though they already released their payloads, they still weighed her down a little bit. In addition, she sacrificed one of her shoulder mounts in order to fend off Miranda. With only one laser mount left, she was sorely pressed to keep off the looming threat. The match entered another act, and this time even if Miranda had thrown aside her sword, she still possessed enough lethality once she unsheathed her backup knife. Yet it never came to use, as Charlotte finally achieved a critical hit to the light mech's weapon arm. Miranda managed to swap the knife to her mech's other arm, but the damage it suffered when holding the shield caused the fingers to grip the knife unsteadily. The distraction allowed Charlotte to get in another couple of shots. When her next cannon shell impacted the light mech again, the competition's inbuilt safeties kicked in and turned the projectile inert. Everyone was silent for a moment, then cheered massively as they experienced an upset. The number 2 favorite of the Fusion Cup surprisingly lost to the 6th-ranked contenders. Charlotte whooped through the microphones even as the people rooting for the other side stood silently, as if still not believing this was happening. Both pilots exited the cockpits while technicians lifted the damaged mechs back to their workshops. 2 pilots and 2 mech designers met in the middle of the arena to congratulate each other and shake hands. Smugness overwhelmed Charlotte's grin as she beheld her defeated rival. It was a good match. I got lucky. Miranda snorted at that. They should penalize heavy mechs even more in these bullshit tournaments. Your mech weighs at least 3 to 4 times as much as mine. Well, the rules don't say you can't bring one too. You're welcome to join the heavy club. We got the fattest asses around. The defeated pilot just huffed in reply. As the 2 pilots talked smack, Vase hesitantly shook hands with Patricia. Her gentle smile and soft, small hand mesmerized him for a moment. Being this close to her amplified the effect of her striking red locks and her lovely dimples. You did a really great job with integrating the flight system to the chassis. It's a lot better than welding a couple of boxes to the armor like I did. If my mech partner hadn't achieved a lucky hit at the end, then this contest might end differently. Patricia shook her head. Don't belittle yourself. What you chose to augment worked out much better in the end. You chose to plug a gap while I doubled down on Miranda's strength. I don't think either choices are wrong, but as you said, it worked out better for you as the extra firepower was a lot more useful than flight capability in our matchup. To be honest, both Miranda and I expected to fight a medium or light mech. Yours is the only heavy mech in contention. The 2 babbled a bit about the design choices they made for their respective mechs. What actually Faze had in mind was trying to facilitate the X Factor, but that was something of a secret weapon to him. He instead diverted Patricia's attention by pointing out he had a hard time convincing Charlotte of making any changes. She only approved the rockets due to agreeing with her affinity for more weapons. Miranda gave me the lead instead. Patricia explained. As a gifted pilot, she's proficient in piloting many variations of light mechs, so when I proposed to adapt your flying system scheme to her mech, she readily agreed. Now that I think about it, I should have involved my partner more in the shaping of her mech. The 2 teams parted after the announcers called in the next contestants. Charlotte and Faze returned to the workshop where the beat-up Kirby rested. While Miranda ultimately inflicted no damage, Charlotte caused enough of it to compensate. The mech's left shoulder was absent a laser mount, and the entire mech still suffered minor internal damage due to overheating. An overheating mech posed serious problems in terms of repairing them. A mech that ran as hot as an oven all over meant that the damaging heat penetrated to the very deepest interior of the mech. To repair such a mech to maximum readiness, Vase was required to pull the mech apart and go over each component one by one. Thin wires and small components were especially vulnerable to damage from excessive local heat. It'll last. It's not the first time I cooked the Kirby. He's built to take a pounding. Charlotte nonchalantly declared as she sank down in a nearby sofa and sipped her energy drink. Vase sighed in exasperation. We only have about an hour to 2 hours before we're called up on the stage again. That's barely enough to refill the rocket launchers and roughly slap another laser mount on the Kirby's empty shoulder. I don't have the time to do the repairs I'm certain this mech needs. Then I'll just roll with the punches. If my Kirby's a little slow, it's no big deal. I'm already used to moving at a snail's pace. Vase really preferred not to hand his chances of winning over to fate. Their stunning upset against Patricia and Miranda attracted some attention from the crowd, but most of them attributed their win to a faulty strategy by their opponents. Winning a match by getting lucky didn't prove his mech designing skills. If Charlotte and FaZe somehow managed to scrounge up another win in the next match, they could prove that they possessed real skill. If Vase sufficiently proved his capabilities, then he'd have a much easier time selling off his own mech. He still kept his ultimate goal in mind. Winning the Fusion Cup was not a life or death matter. It only helped fulfill his other goals. He got on with the repairs while keeping an eye out for how his competitors were doing. Most of them involved high-speed duels or tense battles where both sides clashed their swords against each other. This excited the crowd much more than the one-sided shooting fest Charlotte went through in the previous match. Refilling the empty rocket launchers took very little effort. It only took a little time because the machines available to FaZe could only put in one rocket in its tube at a time. After that, Vase dug into the pile of spare parts the competition offered and picked the closest-looking equivalent of the Turbofire's standard laser mount. Removing the damaged remains from Charlotte's emergency dismounting of the shoulder mount was a delicate operation. If Vase screwed up here, the new laser mount wouldn't fit in the standard eye socket, which enabled the laser mount to link into the mech's targeting systems and draw power for its rotation. Luckily, the mech appeared to have been built for these kinds of actions, as Vase encountered no bumps into making the socket clean. After carefully attaching the laser mount, Vase spent some time making sure the mech's processors correctly adjusted its targeting system to the new mount. Different models required different parameters in order to fire accurately. It didn't perform as well as the original model, but for a quick fix it did the job. Vase swept the moisture from his forehead as he finished the essential repairs. Barring the damage the mech previously suffered before its entry in the Fusion Cup, the Kirby recovered its highest combat state. In the meantime, a couple of other matches took place in the arena. Mechs sporting different amounts of damage and variation entered the stage and duked it out with their counterparts. What FaZe paid the most attention to was the match that decided his next opponent. The match progressed in a one-sided fashion. A hapless knight who ranked 8th in the previous tournament was forced to use his backup pistol against a skirmisher-type mech. The skirmisher wielded 2 submachine guns and ran circles around the mech with ruthless patience. "Looks like that SMG fellow will be my next opponent," Charlotte remarked as she already sized up her next likely opponent. "I hope my armor will be up to the task." The skirmisher fell under the medium weight class but moved almost like a light mech. Vase checked the names of the participants and learned the skirmisher's pilot was called Alexander Steele. His mech designer was a fellow named Michael Dumont, who studied at a private institution based in a second-rate state. "This guy looks tricky." Unlike Patricia, who merely mastered the basics to the utmost level, Michael is more familiar with new advancements and better techniques. "I think Alexander is holding back the full potential of his mech. His current opponent isn't worth exposing his trump card." Charlotte's easy smile turned into a serious frown. She had reason to worry if Alexander's skirmisher possessed a hidden card. Normally, heavy gunners easily shredded skirmishers solely due to the difference in firepower and armor, but what if the skirmisher changed his weapon loadout? The submachine guns work great against knights because they can't catch up to you and don't possess enough firepower to compete at range. But that's obviously not going to work for you, Charlotte. She nodded at that realization. Unlike her own mech, whose weapons were pretty much fixed, Alexander could just put down the SMGs and take a more appropriate weapon into battle, such as a heavy shield or an armor-piercing rifle. This flexibility was an intrinsic advantage all humanoid mechs with functional arms enjoyed. Vase paid attention to Alexander's mech. With his previous experience in optimizing the armor for the Caesar Augustus and Mark Antony, he recognized the mech battling it out in the arena followed a completely different design philosophy. It looked lean, sleek and aerodynamic, as if it wanted to pursue speed much harder than a light mech. And in a major sense it mostly achieved such a result at the cost of limiting its onboard loadout of weapons. The mech lacked any indications of possessing wrist, shoulder or back-mounted weapon platforms. By the time Alexander achieved victory over his humiliated opponent, Vase knew he had very little time left to make some last-minute changes. Should he improve the Kirby's targeting system? Perhaps add a couple more armor plates to increase its bulk. He disliked falling into this guessing game. Every decision was plagued with an indeterminate fog. Did a choice lead to riches or ruin? Stop procrastinating, Vase. You're not even going on stage, yet you're sweating bullets. After taking a deep breath, Vase regained much of his composure. You're right. With the time we have left, I doubt I can make any substantial changes to your loadout. I'm going to work on refining the Kirby. I didn't say anything about keeping my Kirby bare bones. You've done right by Kirby, and I appreciate it. You mech designer types aren't as stuffy and close-minded as everyone says you guys are. You're cool. Thanks. So what's your idea? Charlotte recovered her cheer and grinned deviously at him. Seeing as I'm going to face another speedy type, I'd like you to make the following tweaks. Like and subscribe.